Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, photographing wildlife in the Okavango Delta, presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Russell Gerber. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here today. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining us once again for our Daily Dose of Nature. And today, a fun topic, something slightly different for me that we'll be looking at going through for the next 45 minutes or so, and then hopefully taking some questions from you all. But of course, a focus on photographing the Okavango Delta, and particularly, as Rob said, the wildlife of the Okavango. We'll go into all sorts of details on and tips and tricks for getting the best out of your safari, and touch on a few details about the Okavango itself, of course, to give you a feeling for what makes it such a special place. But it's great to have you with me, and let's fire away and get into it, and hopefully you guys get some wonderful information out of it as we go. So just quickly, before we move on, this first shot, of course, is a shot taken in the Okavango Delta. And what I wanted to focus on today for all of you, to give you a feel for, getting those shots out in the bush and on safari, is that it doesn't always have to be the most incredible gear. Sometimes it's just a moment, and we're going to be focusing on how to maximize those moments and get the best out of each shot that you take. This one was actually taken simply on my phone, if you can believe it, just as we were driving along, big storm building in the distance, beautiful light, beautiful scenery, and to me, that is what makes the Okavango so special, that these moments can appear out of nowhere, and you got to make sure that you have your stuff ready to go in order to capture it. And hopefully after today, I will be able to set you up to achieve that. So just quickly, a little bit about myself. For those of you who haven't watched one of my webinars before, this is me on safari in the Okavango, of course. That's with my lovely wife. And as I said, my name is Russell Gerber. I actually have an undergraduate degree in zoology and African vertebrate biology, a postgraduate honors degree in marine biology, so a little different from the safari aspect, but that has always been a passion of mine. I started work as a safari guide way back in 2004 here in South Africa, and I've guided all over the world in various locations and roles, and also managed safari camps here in Botswana as well, and in the Okavango, which made it or gave it a very special place in my heart. And I'm fortunate enough to continue to travel to that region as a safari guide and expedition leader for natural habitat. And then for the last few years, I've also been working as a wildlife presenter on africam.com, commentating on some wonderful live cameras that are based out in the bush here in Southern Africa. So a lot of time and focus on the natural world here in Southern Africa. And as I said, I've been fortunate enough to actually travel all over the world working as a field guide in all sorts of aspects, even as a scuba diving instructor for those of you who are interested in the underwater world. But that's just a little bit about myself, and hopefully I'm fortunate enough to meet some of you out on a safari this year in person, and we can chat more about all that. But just a brief background on myself. So here we go, another shot, of course, of the Okavango. And of course, today's webinar is going to be all about the shots that I've managed to capture out on safari. And we'll go through various aspects on how I've managed to capture those. But a brief outline for those of you who've watched my webinars before, I do like to give you an outline of what we'll be talking about. Today, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the photography, we do need to just touch on what the Okavango is, for those of you who don't know about it, or where it is, or what it's all about, and what makes it so special. And we'll just touch on a few details about that. As I said, we'll talk about what makes it special and what makes photography so special in the area, and what you're likely, or what you'll need to look out for in terms of getting the best out of your photographic safari and photographic experience here in Botswana. We'll go into the flora and fauna of the Okavango and how to capture those moments on camera, as I said. And that's, of course, going to be our big focus today. Towards the end of our webinar, we'll absolutely talk about gear. It is such a complicated and often controversial department, or if I could say that, of the whole photographic experience. And we'll touch on various aspects of that. And then, of course, lastly, we'll talk about traveling to the Okavango, when to come, and what trips you can join to hopefully come and join me on a safari here with Natural Habitat in the Okavango Delta. So that is pretty much the plan for the evening, and we'll try to stick to that as best we can. And as I said at the end, hopefully making some time for some questions at the end. So do keep those in mind. Fire them through to Rob whenever you have one that comes into your mind about anything you might have queries about as we go through the webinar. So firstly, as I mentioned, we need to quickly highlight where, of course, the Okavango Delta is. And that is a lovely map of Africa, one we've all seen many times before, I'm sure, especially for such well-traveled enthusiasts such as our guests from around the world. But Botswana is right down there where that little red circle is. It's just come onto your screen now in this southern half of Africa. And of course, I am down in Cape Town at the moment, right on the southern tip of Africa. And Botswana is South Africa's our neighbors to the north, directly to the north of us, and is of course a landlocked country. The vast majority of Botswana is in fact a desert. And as we focus in on the country itself, here you can see these are the borders of the country. You can actually see the beautiful outline of it here on this particular map. This is Botswana itself. As I say, our neighbors to the north from South Africa. You'll see the dark green on this particular map are the national parks of the region. And in the top half of your picture, where that large blue body of water is, that is, of course, the Okavango Delta, and what we will be focusing on this evening. The vast majority of the country, as I mentioned, is part of the Kalahari Desert. I've actually done a webinar on the Kalahari Desert here on the Daily Dose of Nature, so you're welcome to go and check that out if you're interested in some more detail on that. But it is a really unique country and very sparsely populated with the nature of that desert environment. So only roughly 2 million or 2.2 million people in Botswana as a whole. Which of course is a very low population density in areas that are difficult to live in certain parts of the country, in the majority of the country. You can see down in the south east of the country is Gaborone or Gaborone, which is the capital of Botswana, and in the north east as well is Francistown, the second largest town in Botswana, and then Maun, you'll see that little airplane and red dot just to the south of the Okavango Delta, is very much the gateway into the Delta. And for any of you coming to visit this year, most of you will be going through Maun before we head off into the remote parts of the Okavango. So that is very much the gateway into the Delta itself. So there you see highlighted in red, that is of course the Okavango Delta. Now, what is it? And what makes it so special? Well, it's not technically a delta at all. It's actually an alluvial fan, if you were going to be particular about things. A delta technically, of course, needs to run into the ocean. This very much runs into the middle of nowhere, into the middle of a desert, really. And the red lines in this little graphic will actually show you the fault lines that were created a number of years ago that have given the Okavango its shape. So the water flows into this region on a seasonal basis, and these fault lines that you can see here coming up have given it its shape. And the two major fault lines in the southern part, close to Maun, you can see those two lines there, very much form almost the border or southernmost border of the delta, as the land below that to the south is slightly raised and the delta doesn't actually really flow over that unless it is a huge flood season, which of course is highly variable. But these different fault lines really did create the shape of the delta that we see now, and has given rise to a huge number of varied environments throughout this region, which of course has created this amazing diversity hotspot for large African mammals here in Southern Africa, particularly in what is otherwise, as I mentioned, a desert region. So it really is a special place and is highly seasonal. So it goes from a flood period where the land mass or the area covered by the delta increases sometimes by 30–40% in size as that rainwater arrives. Bearing in mind it is rainwater from thousands of kilometers away in the highlands of Angola, and as that water slowly flows down, it eventually makes its way into the delta around about this time of year normally, April, May, certainly into June, where the water levels start to rise in those regions. So it is very dependent on water from other countries, which makes it extremely fragile, and it's a reason why it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So now that we know why it's such a special region and what makes it unique is that seasonality, and of course its reliance on water from far away. But because you get this incredible contrast between desert and these absolutely luscious green savanna and wetland systems, you really have the opportunity of photographing a number of different environments in one trip. The one thing the Okavango does not have, and if you're thinking of looking for that when you're down here on your safari, is mountains. It is flat. There is nothing around in the way of mountains. This is an area of flat landscape as far as you can see, dotted by, of course, the beautiful foliage, trees, and of course the fauna that we're all hoping to see when you come on a safari. This particular shot was taken when we're heading out on safari in the morning. For those of you who don't know or haven't been out on safari, you tend to go very early in the morning. We wake up before sunrise, come through for a little snack in the main lodge area before we head out in the vehicles out on a game drive. So what does that mean from a photographic point of view? Well, it means that you need to be absolutely ready to roll the second you leave the camp. And that means the night before you head out on your safari, all your batteries need to be charged. Everything needs to be set up. You need to have your most versatile lens on your camera as you head out in the morning, with, of course, your camera bag packed with anything that you might need out on safari. And we'll go into some more detail of that as we get into the gear portion of things. But you need to be ready to capture these shots, because as you head out, of course, very often the sun will be coming up and you're very likely to get these opportunities of taking spectacular shots. And once again, it doesn't need to be the world's most advanced mirrorless camera or DSLR camera. It can very easily be a cell phone. And every wildlife photographer will tell you that the best wildlife photography camera you can have is the one that you have with you. And sometimes it can capture really beautiful shots, particularly landscape shots. When you're using your phone or the like, or a point and shoot camera, you can get excellent stuff when it comes to shooting landscapes, and particularly sunrises or sunsets. So on this particular chat, folks, we're not going to go into all the various details of shutter speeds, ISOs, and all those in-depth details on capturing shots in terms of the technical aspects of things. We're going to be focusing today on the animals themselves, what behaviors to look out for, how to capture those moments, and as I said, the landscapes themselves and how to be ready to catch those shots as you head out on your trip, or when you're sitting around the table at lunchtime between safaris, thinking about these things so that you can capture those moments when you get out on your trip. So just briefly finishing off on the delta itself, situated in the northwest Botswana, as we saw, a World Heritage Site, as I mentioned, and as I said, a huge area consisting of about 22,000 square kilometers, which is absolutely massive. The average rainfall is very low, like I mentioned as well, very much a desert type region or semi-desert region, with the majority of those rains coming between October and April. So even though we're heading into the dry season for Botswana and the Okavango now, that flood water from Angola, which generally falls around November, December, has flowed all the way down into the Okavango Delta and is arriving around about now. So even when the rains tend to end for the Delta itself, you have this huge influx of water from the highland regions, and that's when the floods tend to arrive. And it, as I mentioned, all falls within the greater Kalahari Basin, which is a desert. And when you look at all that, you think, well, that's great, Russell, but where does all that water go? Well, the vast majority of it actually disappears into the air through evaporation. So it eventually starts to dissipate and the water starts to pull back around about July or August. And by the time we get through to October and November, the waters will be at their lowest, generally speaking. Okay, so getting into the photography side of things, I showed you now just that quick sunrise photography. This was one taken at a sundowner. Sundowners are a safari pastime that we practice. When you go out on your safari, just as it starts to get dark, we'll often take a break, stop the vehicle and hop out for a beverage of your choice, watching as the sun goes down. And these are often incredible opportunities for getting photographs of the sun going down, particularly in this flat landscape that is the Okavango. But the wonderful thing about it, if you look at this particular shot in the bottom right-hand corner as well, is that with these sharp aspects and contrast that you get in your photographs, you often have these little bodies of water in between all the land that you'll be photographing, and it makes this beautiful contrasting mirror effect that you get in your pictures as well. And you know, playing around with your camera and its capabilities is going to be your best friend. You know, the wonderful world of digital photography is that you can take as many as you'd like, and playing around with your settings on your camera at times like this, when you are at a sundowner stop, often gets you, you get a really good feeling for what it can do and how it can achieve things. And in this particular shot, you know, I used a wide angle lens that I had, but it wasn't too wide, around about a 35mm Canon lens, and I had it at around about 24mm, and getting as much of the landscape that I could fit in, always attempting to put, of course, the main subject of your shot a little bit to the left or right. Many of you watching this will know the rule of thirds, and the rule of thirds, of course, breaking your pictures down into blocks of 3 across the bottom and across the top and across the middle. So using that idea of putting your subject at one of those spots, not necessarily always in the middle of your picture. Often it does make it a little bit more interesting, and getting, you know, people to focus in certain regions on the picture as you want them to often tells a story, and that's what photography is all about. So landscape opportunities often best in the Okavango in the early morning and early evening. During the day, when it's really hot and sunny, often it gets a little overexposed, and your best time for your landscape shots, in my opinion, in the Delta are at those different times, early morning and early evening. The other opportunity, of course, for incredible landscape photography is if you can, and you do get the opportunity to do a helicopter flight over the Delta. There's nothing quite like a helicopter flight to give you this kind of angle to get the shot. And once again, very basic settings. You could do this almost on a camera that with absolutely auto settings to get this sort of shot. Relatively the middle of the day, you know, very bright lights all over, but because you've got this beautiful contrast of the dark water the green islands and foliage in between these channels, you often get these beautiful, beautiful shots. And this to me is the quintessential Okavango Delta photograph. You'll also have opportunity to do that in the plane when you fly into these regions. Almost all of the camps that we go to are only accessible by plane. So as you're coming in, once again, you've got to be ready with your camera. So have it with you at all times for the opportunity of getting shots just like this one. I've had many, many guests get shots just like this with their phones, once again, or even on their iPad as you're flying in. And even though you are forced to photograph through a window in most cases, very often you can adjust things and have your camera at a little bit of an angle so that you don't get any glare off that internal window. But this is the kind of shot that you can hope to get on a trip to the Okavango. And as I said, if you're just ready with a camera that you can pick up and take a shot as quick as possible, this is the kind of thing you're going to want to do. Now, most people when they come on safari, of course, are thinking that they must have a huge telephoto zoom. And while that is true for certain wildlife shots, your landscape photography is almost always going to be best captured with a wider angle lens, which of course your cell phone or your point and shoot or your even your iPad is more than sufficient to do, particularly these days. Certain cell phones have got incredible photographs. So bear that in mind before you come out on a safari. You don't always need the big gear to capture these things. So as I say, these opportunities will come up at the most strange times sometimes, but even heading into the Okavango, you got to be ready with your camera before you even start your safari to capture pictures just like this one. So just quickly on the Delta one more time, those arriving waters, like I said, tend to come in around about May, June, and July, just about now what I said. Normally around August, you start to see it dropping off again, heading into September, October, and November when it's at its driest, often the hottest time of the year as well. And any time of year to the Delta is a good time to visit. It just depends what you want to see. So there's always going to be more water around about June and July, less water the rest of the year. And those channels and the water systems are changed all the time. And all those little paths you can see in this particular shot as well are made by elephants and hippopotamus. So the Delta is quite literally changed and formed by the animals that live there. But today, we touched on a little bit of landscape stuff, but what we're really here to talk about is wildlife. And for me, the best landscape shots in the Okavango and in Botswana in general are, of course, taken with animals in them. And I feel like you can get a real feeling for the country and the environment itself from getting these kinds of shots. Now, this was just to the south of the Okavango, a beautiful area, very much on the edge of the desert. But you can see here these zebra walking through the water as they're going along. And in this particular shot, I decided to do it in black and white. Now, there are a number of different reasons for shooting in black and white. And of course, one of the biggest is your black and white or gray animals often come out really, really well in a black and white photograph. Another thing that you can use black and white photography for that I quite like to do is anything where there is almost an overexposure of light. So these zebra were walking through a shallow bit of water, but the sky was almost blown out in a washed out, very light blue color. The water had incredible glare on it at the time. So when you looked at it in color, it really didn't feel like the same photograph. And you switched it to black and white, as I said, for me, particularly with zebra or any other gray animal, which we'll get to in a little while. Often these kinds of photographs work great from a big wide angle point of view. You're going to try to get as much of the picture that you've got in your frame in focus with your subject near the foreground, and then perhaps a little bit of blurring into the background, but as much of the picture as you can get to be in focus in this particular shot. So for me, this is a great way to get landscape photography of the Okavango. and Botswana itself. This one, another one, highlighting the, one of the many different environments of the Okavango, the savanna regions. And this, of course, a lioness walking through the savanna and these beautiful long grasslands. She was on a hunt at the time. And once again, this one, you're trying to get the foreground in focus with a little bit more blur in the background. In this particular instance, because she was the only subject, I wanted to get her as in focus as possible with that lovely, what we call bokeh effect behind her, where it starts to fade away as you move further away from where she is. But the perfect situation like this is, of course, having that light behind you, and late afternoon light in this particular case. Now, your guides and, of course, your expedition leaders who will be with you on your trips will always try and get the best position that we can for photography. And more often than not, that means getting light from behind us onto the subject so we don't get any glare. But that's not always possible. And again, something you have to remember as a wildlife photographer in the Okavango. It's not always going to be the perfect situation. So you have to be ready to get what you can. In this particular instance, she was quite a long way away from me. So while I would always prefer to do a nice landscape-ish shot like this with a wide angle, because she was so far away, that telephoto really did come in handy. And again, we'll touch on the gear that I think is best to have with you when you go out on safari from a minimalist point of view. So we'll go into that in a little bit later. But this is the kind of thing that I love to do from a landscape point of view with my wildlife photography. And again, the Delta itself, its habitats are so diverse. This is just a few of the things you can expect to see from the savanna that we're looking at here, woodlands and riverine forests, the islands that you could see from those pictures that we saw from an aerial view, open water itself, which we're going to touch on a little bit in just a few moments, permanent swamp as well. So again, the opportunity to get out on the water and get photographs from the water, which is really, really special. The seasonal floodplains, areas where you wouldn't otherwise be able to get photos, you now can when the water is high if you come in May, June, or July. So here is one that I was just talking about one of the beauties of taking photographs in the Okavango is being able to get out on the water. Now, this particular shot was taken from a boat, a little flat bottom boat that many of our camps have, depending on the level of the water itself. And this was a beautiful bull elephant in the late afternoon sun. And once again, you can see the light was just capturing just about perfectly with these beautiful sunset colors in the background. But what I wanted to emphasize from pictures like this and the next few that I will show you, and what I love about getting out on the water, whether it be in the mokoros, the traditional dugout canoes, or in the boats themselves, and why you should always have your camera gear with you on these experiences, is that you're able to get at absolute eye level with these animals. This particular elephant bull was about no more than 30 feet away from us, completely relaxed, feeding in the water, and he was happily going about his day. But we were sitting right at the same level as his eye. And to me, that aspect is something that you need to focus on as a wildlife photographer as well. It's trying to get on eye level, if you ever can, with your subject, because it gives you a much better perspective in your photographs. So here's another one, this one in particular with a Cape buffalo. If you can get at that eye level, and that's why I say being on the water allows you so often to do that, get as low as you can with your camera, and you can get these wonderful point of view shots close to the water. Another one up close and personal this time. This one I had to actually take the telephoto off because we were too close to this crocodile. But again, because he was up on the bank, we could get a beautiful shot almost looking up into his eye, which is not something you can often do with an animal like a crocodile, particularly from a Land Rover or the Jeep when you're heading out on your safari drives. So getting out on the water in the Okavango, as I said, a wonderful way to get different aspects and angles on your shots. So here's another one in the water itself. This was a herd of elephants that was playing around in the water. And once again, I chose to go black and white. This was more towards the middle of the day, very harsh light again. And I thought, once again, as we discussed earlier, a big gray animal like this with a lot of gray around it in terms of the rest of its family, and with extra light, going black and white, particularly with elephants, often works really well. So it's definitely a tip I would give you before heading out on safari to capture your pictures. So definitely something worth thinking about when you're taking shots of elephants, particularly in very bright light. But once again, this was an emphasis on being at the same level. The shot was also taken from the boat, and this beautiful young elephant was looking right in our direction. And I just thought, you know, the photo came out really, really well. And I think, once again, it shows how that black and white coloration or selection can really make your pictures pop with the right subject. And again, we're talking about getting at eye level as much as possible. This one we just got lucky, and this is again stuff that I want you to be aware of when you're out on safari. We happen to be below a very large termite mound, which of course is so important to termites themselves, are so important to the landscaping of the Okavango itself, that you do often get these termite mounds around. And this particular wild dog was just on the edge of a termite mound. We were below him, and as you can see, you could get this beautiful photograph shooting up at the dogs, which is something that you almost never ever get. And if you can, make sure you snap away on your camera as much as you can whenever you get at this sort of angle. So once again, getting as close to eye level as possible. Another thing to think about, many of my photographic colleagues and those who are far superior to me on the camera gear, you know, will tell you what you're trying to do with your photos is tell a story. So whenever you see animals in any sort of action, try do your best to get a shot. So this light in particular was not perfect lighting. It was starting to get a little bit too bright, and these lionesses were hunting. She was on a termite mound at our level, and it still, you know, it still managed to portray the power, the strength, the stealth, all in one photograph, even though you didn't have all of the various aspects working in your favor, from lighting, angle, all of those are great things. It could have made it more perfect, but you still managed to capture the moment. And don't ever forget that for most of us, these are not photographs we are going to sell to anybody. It's to help you remember the magical moments of your safari. And of course, watching lions hunt is nothing quite as special as watching that. So if you can, again, make sure you capture those moments whenever you see, particularly animals that can be quite relaxed and sleep a lot of the time, like lions. When they are on the move, make sure you get your shots. So again, the termite mound situation, whenever the animals are up on a termite mound and raised, it's a great time to get shots. Cheetah are wonderful for this. They are almost what I like to call the supermodels of the safari, the safari regions. They love to pose for photographs because they like to be higher up on termite mounds, even fallen logs, things like that. They often are raised up, and you get great opportunities for beautiful shots, just like this one. And it leads us to the next aspect that I wanted to focus on for your photography, and that is, of course, the eyes. Getting the eyes can be quite tricky. Getting light on the eyes can be even more tricky. But as a wildlife photographer, and if you are a big fan of cats like I am, getting those eyes to light up can be very hard, particularly since they have, of course, these rather thick eyebrows that often give shade over those eyes themselves. So any moment that you get, whether they're in the shade like this or there's dappled light and you're able to capture a little bit of the eye in the light, those are the moments you need to be snapping away and getting as many shots as you can, as sharp as you can. When you're taking shots, don't always zoom all the way in. You know, take some zoomed in, some zoomed out, get the whole body, get the face, get just the eye. By the time you're done with all of them, you know, you'll get a feeling for in that particular sighting, what was your favorite shot out of all of that. And for me, I actually ended up really liking this whole picture of his face, even though he wasn't looking right at me. Somehow, it seemed to portray a feeling which is what I was getting at earlier about this feeling you get from photographs, the story you're trying to tell. For me, you know, this just felt like he was very relaxed, and he was. It was a moment where he was just about to fall asleep, but he looked very pondersome, and I thought almost looked like a male model, and I had to capture the shot. So something to think of. Back to our lioness that was walking through the savanna. Well, she managed to lay down after a little while, and she turned perfectly into the sun with the sun behind us. And then you can see you're able to get this wonderful lighting on her eyes. And if that does happen and all things fall in place, you can often end up with shots like this. But it doesn't always go that way. Sometimes they're in the shade. And this is one of my favorite shots from the Okavango Delta of a young female leopardess. And we were actually in not great lighting conditions, pretty much the middle of the day when we found her. And she happened to be in a tree that was opposite our lodge. So we were able to stay with her pretty late. And in fact, we ended up watching her from the deck while we were having lunch, which is one of the magical things of the bush and going on safari. But this lovely leopardess was in complete shade, which meant that you really had to play with your camera settings. Now, of course, you can, you know, for those of you who know your camera stuff, you can push your ISO up, you can drop your shutter speeds. There are a number of different ways to get more light into your photographs. And I'm not going to go into that detail right now. There are wonderful webinars on that, particularly done by Richard Gerber, that you're welcome to go and check out. But for me, what I wanted to tell you is don't always think that because the light's not perfect, you're not going to be able to get great shots. She was in complete shade, but we managed to get in a position where we had enough light on her and not too much light coming through from behind her to wash her out, that we were able to get this shot. And don't ever forget or underestimate the power of post-production as well. There are wonderful editing tools out there that you're able to adjust your photographs. And if I can give you one bit of advice that you take away from today, it's that if you can, on your cameras, shoot in RAW. It helps you get way more information in your photographs. And when you do get home and you actually try to work a little bit on your pictures with a post-processing software, you're able to do a lot of adjustment in your photographs. In this particular case, I was able just to lighten up the light on her eyes and on her body a little bit without her being washed out or the background getting washed out as we lightened her body up a little. So just something to bear in mind. And as I said, this ended up being one of my favorite shots from the Okavango itself. But focusing on the eyes is what we're talking about. Black and white, once again, for elephants often turns out really well, but you can see here the light was perfectly on this elephant's eye, and even in black and white, it looks amazing. You can play around with editing as well and put some color just on her eye, but I thought in black and white it actually looked pretty amazing. And again, you know, that feeling of looking into an elephant's eye, there's nothing quite like it, and it really does, you know, give you a real, it moves your soul a little bit. Certainly it does for me. So certainly something to think about. The eyes are where it's at. Even something like a hyena, I couldn't get the perfect eye. He didn't look right back up at us, but I caught just a little bit of that light on its eyes in the early morning, and it's enough to give it a little bit more character in your photographs, even in a gruesome photo like this one, and with that beautiful green background. Once again, you know, just managed to make the whole thing stand out really beautifully. Once again, another wild dog, this one looking into the light, and we were able to get that beautiful orange eye once again. So again, just think about that. Another thing for you to think about whenever you get the opportunity is when cats or any other animal for that matter, but particularly cats, look up. And often they do. Leopards, lions will often look up at the sky for a vulture, or if there's something above them in the tree, often they will look up. And when they do, you can get amazing shots as the light catches their eye as well. So keep that in mind when you're out on your safaris. Always click away whenever the cats look up. And I've got a lot of pictures of that happening. This one turned out just perfect. Another lovely leopardess that she was looking straight at us, but she was laying on her back below us. And she looked right back up at me with the camera. And as you can see, that's when everything comes together in a perfect world. And in this particular instance, I just went for a shot of her eye. Once again, different shots, different things. This was the next picture that I took of her, this time just of her face. And depends on who you are, but I actually preferred the one of just her eye. But again, that's up to you and your composition and how you like things to look. But for me, this was absolutely a beautiful moment, and really fortunate that she happened to look up at us at that time. So when cats look up, take pictures. But you don't always get that lucky. Sometimes you have to shoot from below. This was that same leopardess that I showed you a few shots back when she was playing around a little. You could see the background was completely bright. So I did have to darken things up a little in post-production, and her eyes, I could lighten them up a little bit if you do want to do that. Sometimes you can leave your pictures completely as you took them. Sometimes a little bit of adjustment it really does make for a beautiful photograph. And when the lighting's not perfect, post-production is absolutely your friend. Once again, you don't always have to be at the same level. This was from below, but we actually made the vehicle go back quite a way so that we could get close to being in line with this beautiful leopard cub. That requires a nice big telephoto lens, and we changed angles, and she was looking the other way. And again, just to give you an idea of the difference between color and black and white, you can choose which you prefer. I think each one has its place, but once again, trying to get the eyes is what you're doing most, and getting the face in particular. As you can see, the nice sharpness on the whiskers, and everything looks really nicely in focus with everything blurred behind it. And that's, of course, just a touch on getting technical, of course, getting your f-stop as low as possible on your camera to make sure that you're getting your subject focused and the background as blurry as possible for that bokeh effect. Another black and white shot, this one with a little bit more post-production, playing around with really darkening out the background, pushing out the highlights. Again, this is more of a sort of artistic impression, but something you can certainly play with your photographs in post-production. Not perfect lighting on this male leopard when we found, or it was a female leopard. She was an old lady. But again, when it's not perfect lighting, you can still get wonderful shots and play around with them in post-production. Another black and white photo, sort of more landscape photograph, again with zebra. To me, another species that works really well for color, for black and white. And then just briefly, I wanted to touch on, this whole positioning issue that we have. Sometimes the animals do not cooperate, and they have the sun right behind them. Here you can see this big male lion had the sun right behind him. So you have this backlighting issue. It's, again, not a major issue. Get the shot first. You can often fix that in post-production as well to bring the face back into a nice lighting, and you can darken the background a little bit in your photograph. So backlighting can really make for beautiful pictures and framing for your subject. Silhouettes, of course, with backlighting, you can play around with that as well on your camera. Once again, post-production, you can also play around with it. If you're shooting in RAW, you have a lot more flexibility for getting these kinds of shots, which are very popular for a lot of wildlife photographers. So it's absolutely achievable. When we're out on sightings just like this, we'll often move around if we can get low enough, and you're able to get these wonderful silhouette shots. This one, of course, of a lioness who was up on a rock. And lastly, when you're looking at the cats, one thing you're looking for as well in hippos, also even crocodiles that we saw, is wait for that yawn. Often you'll be able to see when they're about to yawn, be ready with your camera, and you can often get really fun, sometimes ferocious photographs of these little critters. But a yawn makes for a great photograph, and another behavior that you should look out for when you're out on your safari. Wait for them to yawn, and then you can often get these kinds of shots. Your expedition leader will always tell you when they're about to yawn. It's something we always try to help you with. And then, of course, the macro photography that is available to you out there, you can do with your phone, you can do with a telephoto lens. There's plenty of opportunities for things like this, a lily in the water of the Okavango itself, and then other beautiful flowers. This I actually took with a 100-400 zoom lens, which just goes to show you can use just about any lens to do just about anything. And a beautiful shot of this was an impala lily, you know, to give you a feel for the other beautiful things that you can take pictures of. And these are often just around the lodge. You know, you don't even have to go out on drive. Once again, you can get beautiful shots just like this with your phone. So it's always worth thinking about when you are between game drives, taking a little walk down the path, you know, your walkways. Don't wander off into the bush unattended, but certainly close to the walkways is often beautiful things to take pictures of and something for you to think of when you're in the Okavango. So just quick, before we run out of time, I wanted to touch on gear. There are thousands of options out there. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning of our chat, the best camera is the one that you have. So, you know, gear has become so expensive. You can get incredible things for not so much money. You can get unbelievable things for huge amounts of money. It all depends on your budget. Chat to your local camera store before you buy, though. After chatting, go back home, look at some of the webinars that we've done. Richard, as I said, Gerber has done some wonderful ones on gear as well. There's plenty of reviews on gear. I shoot on Canon. Richard shoots on Sony. Nikon is incredible. Fujifilm is amazing. There are endless options out there. If you only have your cell phone, it's also a wonderful tool for capturing your safari stuff. But bear in mind, with your phone, you're never going to be able to get the telephoto sharpness that you will with a mirrorless camera like this one, or of course a DSLR camera. When you do come out, if you do have the budget for a DSLR or mirrorless camera, I do suggest at least having two lenses. One that would be for your more wide angle stuff or more general stuff. It just depends on what you're interested in, but something like a 24-105 would be great. Even a nifty 50 for taking around 50mm lens would be fun. And then make sure that your second lens is something more of a zoom lens. The most popular, I would say, in terms of not being too big and bulky as a telephoto lens, and certainly one I've used for many years, is the 100-400 lens. Get whatever you can afford. Honestly, there's so many options out there. As you can see, this is just the current Canon range in the mirrorless department. This isn't even the DSLR range. And they just grow and grow and grow, and there's more and more stuff available. And as I say, get what you can afford. If you can only bring your phone, bring your phone. But make sure that you know, if you have your phone, you're not going to get as sharp of photos, certainly not in long distance in telephoto, if the animals are further away than those who have a telephoto lens. Something to bear in mind, though, of course, is these days point and shoots have come a huge distance, and you can get often the best of both worlds for not too much money. So I would definitely look at the good old point and shoot, and there's some amazing Sony, Canon, and Fujifilm options out there. Have a look, see what you can find and what you can afford. Get the best you can. And if you follow the tips that we spoke about and the behaviors and things that animals will do on the trip, and just these few little tips will help you get a long way in capturing the action while you're out here and getting your memories. You of course need something to put this on as well. Having an iPad or a laptop with you when you come out on a photographic safari is really useful to get a nice full picture of what you're looking at, because sometimes, you know, just looking back at your pictures on your camera screen, it's a little small. So having something to look at them is great. Of course, you must have somewhere to store it as well, whether you're downloading it onto your iPad, your laptop, or, if I can recommend, external memory devices. You must do that as well, so you back up your pictures so you don't have any catastrophes on your safaris. You'll also need a couple of really good memory cards for your camera. Chat to your camera store salesman about that. They've got, again, huge options. Try to get the best you can for the most you can afford, and that's about it. Batteries as well. Make sure you have spare batteries for your camera. We're always out on safari a long time, and I can't tell you how many times people have run out of battery in the most inopportune moments, me included, and it happens at the worst time. So make sure you have all your stuff fully charged and spare batteries when you go out on safari. Coming to Botswana, when to come, how to come? Well, there's some wonderful options with Nat Hab, of course. Our various scheduled departures that come out, as well as, of course, your custom safaris. You're always welcome to get in touch with us for that. When to come? Honestly, any time is a good time for the Okavango Delta. I would always recommend the best time of year being around about now, April, May, June. Tends to be, for me, my most favorite time. If you're looking for the biggest animal interactions and predator interactions, then October, November, it's super hot, but you get amazing, amazing animal sightings in terms of animals hunting, particularly that time of year. But at safari, you never know. It's often luck of the draw, and we go to amazing safari destinations to make sure that we maximize those opportunities. So these are some of the trips that I was speaking about, Secluded Botswana being one of our departures, Maremi Game Reserve. This particular area is Vumbra, Jau Concession. All of these are highlight areas of the Okavango, incredible places to go. And I wish I had more time, but I do want to give you some time for questions. So I'm going to have to stop now. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope that gave you some insight into what to look for in your shots and in your photography, and some creative ideas. As I said, there's so much more we can get into technically, but I'll leave that for another time. Rob, you got any questions? Fire away, man.
All right, thank you. Now, before we start with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in the control panel. All right, so let me ask you this. When the animals are on a termite mound, do the termites bother them?
No, so most of our termites in this area are actually nocturnal. So they tend to be at least a couple of feet underground where the animals are lying at that time. So most of the time they're not bothered at all. Some of them are abandoned termite mounds, but because they're so incredibly well made, those structures will often hold their shape and size for decades after they've been abandoned, depending on how big it was before it was abandoned. So no, they don't get bothered by it, not at all.
How close do you get when you're taking close-ups?
Again, it varies. So we will often try to get within a comfortable range for the animal, and on these safaris, because many of our regions, the animals are so habituated to the vehicles, often they will walk past us or even closer to us, not with any interest in us whatsoever, but just simply walking past the vehicle. And it's often a time, you know, where you can get your most intense sightings and experiences, and times where they can get as close as what see, I always struggle with the whole meters and feet thing, but let's say 3, so let's call it 10 feet. You know, sometimes within even 10 feet, you'll sometimes get animals like a lion walking past your vehicle within that distance. It's not common, and it's not something we try to push onto the animals, but if they come to us in that way, you can get really, really close and get really, really close up shots. Many of the photos that you've seen today were taken off of my cell phone. Others, I had to quickly change my camera because the telephoto was too long. I couldn't get a shot, and you had to switch to a much shorter camera just to be able to get a picture. So yeah, the animals can get really close from time to time, but most of the time they're at least 30 to 60 feet away from us.
So when you talk about bringing a versatile lens for early morning, which lens do you prefer?
So as wide as you can go. For those of you who have a phone, I often use my a good camera phone as your kind of wide angle early morning camera. I would use that if you've got one, because it really covers you in a lot of ways. But otherwise, a 15 to 35 mil lens is very, very popular for any wide angle shots, and that's going to give you so much to work with. So anything with that sort of a range would be, really do you pretty much cover you for any of those wide angle shots for sunrise or sunset. I think you'd be more than happy with that.
So do you shoot in black and white, or do you change that in post?
I change it in post. You can, of course, change it on site, but I sometimes feel that if I do that, it sometimes takes a little long. I don't always know the settings perfectly to switch back to color quickly. So if I did want to capture something in color and you've forced it to shoot in black and white, you can't change that back, whereas you can switch the other way around. So good question. I tend to switch to black and white in post.
Do you use a polarizer for water shots, or do you fix glare in post-production?
I do all in post-production. And again, another good question. For me personally, I don't tend to use any kind of lens filter or polarizer on my lenses themselves. I try not to interfere with the beautiful glass that is already in the lens, so I try not to have anything in front. Again, each to their own, but for me, I prefer to keep it without anything on front. What I do use often is a lens hood, a hood on the front of the lens to protect the lens from any knocks or bumps as we drive around. I find that makes me feel more comfortable with not, being or getting close to hitting the lens on anything. But in terms of polarizers, anything like that, no, I don't use anything on the front of the lens, just that lens hood.
What is your preferred editing software?
I'm a Lightroom man, personally. I find that to be the most intuitive. I've done quite a lot with the Apple software as well, if you're looking to edit stuff quickly, which I think is just iPhoto, I think it's called. Those two have done me covered me in more than enough, but I have to say the vast majority of what I use for editing is Lightroom.
So are there hot air balloon flights over the Okavango Delta?
They are in certain areas. There are not all of the camps offer it. It depends on each of their offerings. Some have hot air balloons. Many have the helicopter option, and that's what I've done in the Okavango. I've actually only done the hot air balloons in East Africa and Namibia. But I'll have to come back to you. I can't remember where the hot air ballooning is in the Delta. I don't know even if they do it anymore. Most have switched to the helicopter as an option for sightseeing now.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Russell. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for some closing comments.
Thanks, Rob. Sorry I went on a bit long today, folks. It's such a broad topic. It's hard to keep in time. And I wanted to answer more questions for you, but I hope this gave you some good insight into, as I say, some creative ideas for your photography, and also things to think about when you're in your sightings. There's, as I said, so many technical things we could go into, and there are wonderful webinars out there on that sort of stuff. But think about these things we spoke about today, and I promise you, you will get amazing photos, to take home with you after your trip, and that's what it's all about in the end. So hopefully, I'll see you out there on safari later this year, and if not, we'll see you here on the Daily Dose of Nature. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with Nat Hab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.